This morning, we were going through the book of Luke, specifically chapter 15. And within this chapter, we noticed three different types of people. Or introduced three different types of people, really looked at only two. And within this chapter, seeing these two different individuals, we saw the sheep, the one who has fallen away, the one who is lost. And we saw Jesus, who is the good shepherd, who is actively looking and searching for that which is lost. And in chapter 15, verses 8 through 10, not only did we notice the lost sheep, that is the priceless value of the lost, we noticed the lost coin restoring the honor of the lost, and how this woman who had 10 coins, and we looked at the historical background behind that, and that it wasn't just the coins that is money, it was in fact what it represented, that is her honor and the home. And now that it was restored, she can rejoice. Well, after Jesus gives these two parables, defending himself, saying, this is why I'm eating with these individuals, what I'm doing is not wrong, in fact, you should be doing it, he then goes into a third parable. He talks about the lost son. We know him as the prodigal son, welcoming home of the lost. Welcoming home of the lost. And within this parable, we see three different types of people. We see two sons and a father. And starting out in this verse, it says, verse 11, "And he said, a man had two sons. The younger of them said to his father, 'Father, give me the share of the estate that falls to me.' So he divided his wealth between them, and not many days later, the younger son gathered everything together and went on a journey into a distant country, and there he squandered his estate with loose living." Now, within these few verses, and we'll notice a few more in a moment, what I'd like to do is break down this entire parable and give attention to this one parable, because Jesus is driving home a point that he is trying not just for the sinner, that is the tax collector and the sinners, he's actually pointing out the wrong in the hearts of the Pharisees and the scribes. In verses 11 through 16, we see the fallen son of a rejected father. The fallen son of a rejected father, verses 11 through 16. And the verses that we noticed, verses 11 through 13, look at verses 11 through 12. A selfish and loveless request. We see a selfish and a loveless request from the son. What exactly does the son ask of his father? Father, I would like to have my share of the inheritance, my share of the estate. Go ahead and give it to me, please. I would rather have that now than wait until you pass on from this world. When somebody receives an inheritance, it's within the word itself. You inherit something, but the only way you can really inherit something is if the person who has it to begin with is passed on from this world. Well, that's how inheritance works. But he says, I want it now. I don't want to wait. What he's actually saying is, I would rather you be dead and then wait for my inheritance. I would rather you die now, Father, and I have my riches now, than have to wait and endure this presence of yours to prolong what's already coming to me. Just go ahead and give me my money so I don't have to worry about it when you die. Well, a lot of people have that kind of attitude, do they not? The way they live, I don't care if Jesus died. I want to live the way I want to live. Well, Jesus gave his life as a ransom for many, but people do not care. I would rather have the riches of this world than receive that and wait later. I don't care who has to die in the process. I want it now. Sadly, in our country, really the entire world, but let's make it personal. Within our country today, do we not have that kind of attitude? Let's make it shorter. What about in our own personal lives? You have things called selfies. That's harmless. What are you doing? It is in the title. I am taking a picture of myself. Well, what about the different mottos for fast food? Have it your way. If it's not your way, you send it back and we'll redo it until you are satisfied. And what about fast food? It's fast. We want it now. We want it here. We don't want to wait. Over time, our country has become very impatient. And our culture has become, I want it now, satisfy me. I don't care about anybody else. And sadly, and it's scary to see that creep into the church. Because it's already happened. It's not, well, I wonder if it's going to happen to the church. Brethren, it's already happened to the church. The church wants things now. We don't care, even if it means our brother or sister gets hit in the crossfire. We want it now. That's not the attitude that we need to have. Jesus says there are some people in this world who have a selfish and loveless lifestyle. Their requests are selfish and loveless. What about verses 13 to 15? A squandered and loose living. Not only is there a selfish and loveless request, but there is a squandered and loose living from this young man. Look at verses 13 to 15. And not many days later, the younger son gathered everything together and went on a journey into a distant country. And there he squandered his estate with loose living. Now, when he had spent everything, a severe famine occurred in the country, and he began to be impoverished. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, and he sent him into his fields to feed swine. What is this man facing due to the consequences of his actions? Well, let's look at the text. In verses 13 to 15, look at the progression of this man's decision. He gathered everything that he had. But not only that, it says, not many days later, which means he stayed within his father's house for a few days before he left. Now, I didn't actually notice this until reading it, that can you imagine being the father? You have given everything to your son. You have provided everything. He comes to you and says, I would rather you be dead so I can have the money. And the father says, all right, well, here's everything that you have. My other son, here is your share. And can you imagine the tension within the home? Knowing that any minute now, any second, my son is fixing to leave. Because I know what he's fixing to do. I've given him tons of money. I've given him half of my estate. What is he going to do? Well, he's going to run off and do something with it. And it says that he gathered everything that he had, all of his money, all of the belongings that his father had given him. It says that I gathered all of it. And what else? He went into a distant land. He got as far away from his father as he possibly could. I don't care about my father. I don't care about my family. I care about what I want to do with the money that I now have. And when somebody receives that much freedom with no discipline, what do you think is going to happen? Their life will be squandered, and it will be a loose living, and at the very end, they will be face down in the mud with a bunch of pigs. That's what's going to happen to this young man. Now, look at the progression. Went into a distant land. He went far away from his father. He squandered his estate on loose living. You could say the progression is this. He once had everything because he had a father who provided everything. Now, he has absolutely nothing because he lived a life worth nothing. You know, sadly, within the church, because that's what we're talking about here, that's what Jesus is referring to within this parable. He's going to drive home a point. Your brother has come back, which means at some point he was already here. Sometimes within the church, we have fellow brethren, brothers and sisters who say, you know what? Forget my family. I'm going to try and go away as far as I possibly can from this kind of lifestyle because I'm tired of it. I want to do what I want to do. Well, how far do you think they'll get? Well, they might live for a very long time doing what they want to do, but their life will be bitter. Their life will be full of, if I can say this, refuse, as Paul would say. Everything that I had is worthless. In the Greek, literally dung compared to what I have now compared to Christ. Can you imagine receiving Christ and then saying, you know what, I don't want that anymore. I want to go back to that which is worthless. That's exactly what this young man is doing. He once had everything, but he left his father so that he could do whatever he wanted. Now look at verse 16. It's not just a squandered and loose living, but it is a shameful and a lost soul. A shameful and lost soul. Look at verse 16. And he would have gladly filled his stomach with the pods that the swine were eating, and no one was saying or giving anything to him. Where is this young man right now? This man is as far away from his family as he possibly can be. He is living in a strange land and knows absolutely nobody. And because he is in a strange land where he doesn't know anybody, and because of the lifestyle that he has now lived, he has squandered his estate with loose living, and now he is full of shame and he is lost within. He has no idea what to do from this point. All that he knows is, I'm by myself. In fact, the people that are around me don't care about me because they see that I'm out here with the pigs. I can't go in and sit with them. They won't even give me any food. I am starving. I am by myself. I would rather, the food of the pigs looks good to me. This is how low my life is at this point. I am living like a pig. I'm living like swine. Brethren, this is what happens when we live in sin. We live like pigs. We look at the world and we say, man, is there anything worth living for? Is there anything in this life that I can do that will make me happy? Well, this life can't provide you anything that will make you happy. But look what the conclusion is. Actually, before we get to the conclusion, this idea of a shameful living, he left a place where there were people who loved him and would provide for him, a place where no one would, but now he is at a place where nobody cares about him and nobody gives him anything. What exactly does sin do to somebody? Let's just think about this for a second. If somebody says, I would rather go out on my own and I would like to live my life the way I want to live, what exactly is that going to do to you? Well, I'm not going to lie. It looks like a lot of fun. In fact, it doesn't just look like a lot of fun. It is a lot of fun. This man had a great time for a short amount of time. It says that he spent his entire estate on loose living, which means he partied, he slept around, he drank, he indulged himself in anything and everything that he wanted to because he could. He had that freedom. But because of that decision, this is what sin did to him. It took him farther than he was willing to go. It costed him more than he was willing to pay. And it kept him longer than he was willing to stay. That's what sin will do to somebody. That's what sin will do to me and you. Sin will take you farther than you're willing to go. Sin will cost you more than you're willing to pay. And sin will keep you longer than you're willing to stay. But Satan doesn't want you to know that. Satan does not care about you. In fact, what he's trying to do is bring you down with him because he knows that it hurts God. You are just a pawn to Satan, but you are a child to God. And so many times people think that it's reversed. God doesn't care about me. I'm just a pawn in His will. He doesn't care about me. Look at all these souls. He's too busy. He doesn't have time for me. And Satan says, but I've got time for you. I've got time for you. Let me introduce you to so-and-so. They can give you a really good time. Why don't you come with me to this party? And I'll introduce you to this group of people who are like-minded. Because God is withholding something good from you. Genesis chapter 3. Well, is God withholding something good from us? No. In fact, God is saying, I will freely give that which is good to you. And I will warn you not to go towards that which is evil and wrong. Because it will do this to you. It will make your life, you won't even know what to do with yourself. It won't be worth it anymore. Well, what about verses 17 to 14? A forgiven son of a receiving father. A forgiven son of a receiving father. So far, it's kind of gloomy. You know, we've been reading through this passage, and just in the first 6 verses, I'm kind of depressed myself. Is there any hope for this young man? This man is literally eating pig slop. That's how low his life has gotten. Is there any hope for this man? Well, look at verse 17. The realization of his sin. It says, but when he came to his senses, he said, how many of my father's hired men have more than enough bread, but I am dying here with hunger? He realizes that sin has taken him from where he needs to be. When he came to his senses, I want to focus in on this statement. When he came to his senses, who's speaking this parable? It's Jesus the Christ. Jesus says, when this young man came to his senses, he realized, I need to go back home. What is Jesus implying here within his teaching? That when somebody sins, they are not making any sense. Now, he is not saying that, that they're not in control. That is that, they didn't know what they were doing, but when he came to his senses, when he actually came to himself, oh, you know what? I'm in control again. What I did wasn't my fault. That's not what Jesus says. Jesus says what he did was wrong. And when he realized that, he finally had sense. If you read in the book of Proverbs chapter 6 and verse 32, hundreds of years before Jesus was even born, there was a man by the name of Solomon who was inspired by God, given wisdom by God to write this down. It says in Proverbs chapter 6 and verse 32, the one who commits adultery with a woman is lacking sense. He who would destroy himself does it. Now, this is a very specific context talking about somebody who participates with unauthorized or strange women, as Solomon would say. But in a general application, he who commits adultery lacks sense. What does the inspired writers of the New Testament call their generation? Their adulterous generation. A generation that has cheated on God. How does one cheat on God? How does one commit adultery against God? Well, they have committed themselves to God. They have made a covenant in marriage with God. And then they realize, you know what? I don't like this marriage anymore. It's boring. It's not what it used to be. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to divorce God without the reason that I really have the right to. And I'm going to make a covenant with somebody else. That is the world. And God says, you are committing adultery with me. And though the one who commits adultery is lacking sense. You know, growing up, I might be playing some video games or outside playing, and my daddy would tell me, hey, I need you to come inside and take care of the trash. And I was like, okay, I'll do that in a minute. Well, after many times of him encouraging me, hey, you need to get this done, he says, son, are you not listening to me? So of course I'm listening. He says, well, why isn't this getting done? I've told you countless times. Is it going in one ear and out the other? Use your head for something other than a hat rack, he would tell me. Have some sense in your head. Well, that's exactly what's going on here. When we disobey a direct command from God, as a child of God, we are lacking sense. But it is a choice to lack sense. You know, have you ever heard of blissful ignorance? I would like to live in ignorance. That way I don't have to face the consequences of my actions. That's not how that works, brethren. You will face the consequences of your actions whether you're ignorant or not. It's just a matter of, do I want to acknowledge it or not? We're going to receive the back end of it whether we like it. But it's going to come no matter what, whether we're ignorant or aware of it. Well, this man was ignorant, blind. He blinded himself. He was willfully senseless, and look where it got him. He's eating with pigs. But when his senses came back to him, when he came back to his senses, he realized, you know what? I have nothing. My Father has everything, and I am dying because of it. When a soul who has fallen away realizes that they have nothing, and that their Father, that is their Heavenly Father, has everything, and that they are dying, they can do what this young man does in verses 18 through 19. Look what it says in verses 18 through 19. Repenting of his sin. It says in verse 17, but when he came to his senses, he said to him, saying, how many of my father's hired men have more than enough bread, but I am dying here with hunger? I will get up and I will go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and in your sight. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me as one of your hired men." Look what the son was doing. "I will get up and go to my father." He's swallowing his pride. "I will admit to my father I have sinned against him." He is accepting responsibility. "I am not worthy to be called your son." He is humbling himself. "Please take me back." He's begging for forgiveness. And he doesn't even say, "Please take me back as your son." He says, "Take me back as one of your lowest servants." Because it is better to be the lowest servant to you than trying to rule the world by myself. Is that not what it's like in God's family? It's better to be the lowest servant within the church than ruling the world. Is that not what Jesus actually tells us to do? Humble yourself. I didn't come to earth to be served. I came to earth to serve my creation as an example to you of what you need to be doing. Well, this man realized his position. I have no right to demand anything. In fact, what I deserve is death. I deserve to die out here with the pigs and to be eaten by pigs. I deserve the lowest form of death. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to swallow my pride because it's not about me. I've squandered everything in my life. I've lived the way I wanted to, and look where it's gotten me. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to swallow my pride. I'm going to accept the responsibility of my actions. Look, I've done all of these things. I will work. I will work for my food. Just let me come back, please. So many people get stumped on the very first one. If they cannot swallow their pride, they're not getting anywhere. And you know what? It might not be that they don't want to swallow their pride. Maybe it's the case that it's a completely different extreme. I'm not worthy to even show back up to my Father's house because I know for a fact He won't accept me back. Do you really know that? Do you really know 100% in your heart that God the Father will say, "Anthony, you have squandered everything that I have given you, and now you decide to come back to me begging on your knees? I don't want that in my kingdom. You can go and find your riches somewhere else." Is God really going to say that? No! Look what Jesus says is going to happen. Look what He says in verses 25 to 32. Well, starting in verse 20 to 24. "So he got up and came to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion for him and ran and embraced him and kissed him. And the son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and in your sight. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his slaves, 'Quickly, bring out the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand and sandals on his feet. And bring the fattened calf, kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and has come to life again. He was lost and has been found.' And they began to celebrate." What happens here? Look what his father was doing. We saw what the son was doing. Look what the father was doing. He was waiting outside looking for him. He desired his son to come back home. Look what it says. "So he got up and came to his father, but while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion for him." How do you think his father saw him? His father was out. I could just picture it. His father has a special chair outside his house, and within a certain period of the day, he goes outside and he sits and he waits. Can you imagine the servants and his other son looking and just the hollow shell of this father who lost his son? And he's sitting there just looking out in the distance and he's just waiting and waiting and waiting. And finally, one day, because he never gave up on him, he sat there and he was patient. And in the distance, he sees a familiar figure walking towards him. And what does the father do? He doesn't sit there and wait. He doesn't have a speech ready for him of, man, he's fixing to get it. What he does is he gets up and he runs out to his son. He bear hugs him and he gives him a kiss saying, "You're finally home. You're finally home." And remember the speech that his son actually prepared? What I'm going to do is I'm going to tell my father, "I have sinned against you and I have sinned against heaven. Please take me back. I'll be the lowest servant. I'll work for my food." What does the son get out? Look what he says. And the son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and in your sight. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. He didn't even get to finish his speech. I'm not worthy to be called your son. And he was fixing to say, I'll be a servant. I'll work for it. The father says, don't worry about it. You're not going to be are you kidding me? I've been waiting days after days since you left. I'm not going to make you a servant. I'm going to make you a son again. In fact, this is what we're going to do. I'm going to put the finest clothes on you. I'm going to give you a ring. I'm going to give you shoes. We're going to throw a feast. I've been waiting for this day for countless days, and you finally come back home. What does the father do? The father desired to have him back. He had compassion on him. He desired to love him freely. He ran to embrace him. He desired to have fellowship with his son, and he kissed him. He desired to show his love. God, like we mentioned this morning, is not a toddler who plays with ants, who when he gets bored bouncing them back and forth, he squashes the ant. What the Father is just that. He is a father. He is waiting for his son, and it has a desire for him to come back. He has a desire to love him freely, a desire to show fellowship, and a desire to show love. All God needs is for you to come home. That's all that He needs you to do. Everything else He is willing to do, but He can't do it unless you come back home. Well, look at verses 25 to 32. The furious son of a rebuking father. You know, after this very depressing introduction to this parable, you finally have a reuniting of a father and son. You see making amends. You see a relationship being rebuilt. And then this happens. Look at verses 25 to the end of the chapter. It says, verse 25, Now his older son was in the field, and when he came and approached the house, he heard music and dancing. And he summoned one of the servants and began inquiring what these things could be. And he said to him, Your brother has come, and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has received him back safe and sound. But he became angry and was not willing to go in. And his father came out and began pleading with him. But he answered and said to his father, Look, for so many years I have been serving you, and I have never neglected a command of yours. And yet you have never given me a young goat, so that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came, who has devoured your wealth with prostitutes, you killed the fattened calf for him? And he said to him, Son, you have always been with me, and all that is mine is yours. But we had to celebrate and rejoice, for this brother of yours was dead and has begun to live, and was lost and has been found. In verses 25 to 27, we see that this other brother, he was a hard worker. Now, you're probably thinking, don't commend this man. Did you see his attitude? Well, let's just see what he's doing. How are we introduced to this man? He's out in the field working. He is a hard worker for his father. Well, he was laboring in the fields, but that was just a passing by statement about this man. We really see what his true colors are. And which, by the way, before, just in case I forget, let's make this application. Just because you're working hard in the kingdom does not mean you are right with God. Now, hang on a minute, preacher. I'm laboring in the field harder than anybody. Well, that's what this young man said as well. And what does the father say? You've got the wrong attitude. You're laboring and you desire special attention. That's not what all this is about. You are working for me because you want to work for me. You're working for me and you've already received your reward. Why are you complaining? That's what the father would say. Too many people in the church think that they are entitled because they are hard workers, in quotes. When you read in the Old Testament how I believe it's in the book of Hosea, where we talked about it in our minor prophets class. They said, you know what, we'll just offer a whole bunch of sacrifices and God will be pleased with it. And Hosea says, no, that's not what God wants. He wants you to have a good attitude. He wants you to have a good heart. He wants you to do it with the right attitude. The psalmist would say, a broken and a contrite heart is what God desires. He doesn't, yes, He cares about you obeying His commands, but He wants you to obey the commands with the right attitude. Well, look at verses 28 to verse 30. He was an entitled worker. He wasn't just a hard worker, he was an entitled worker. Look at verse 28. He became angry. He was selfish, wanting the attention for himself. He did not join the celebration. He was bitter and petty that he was not being celebrated. In verse 28, we see the father pleaded with him. He was close-minded and hard-hearted. And in verses 29 to verse 30, it says, you didn't throw me a party. He was prideful and arrogant. And you know who this young man represents? He represents the Pharisees and the scribes. He represents men who knew better. This man represents really the perfect, what the Jewish people would say, the perfect religious person. You know, in the Jewish culture, the fathers would look to their sons at a young age and say, you see those Pharisees? They uphold the law. They defend the law of Moses. You need to grow up to be like one of them. And this is the kind of man that they represent. They represent men who are bitter. They represent men who are selfish and prideful and arrogant. They represent men who, when they see a fellow brother or sister come back home, they won't even step in the same room with them. Do you fall into that category? Because if you do, if you don't want to be in the same room with somebody who God has forgiven, how do you expect to get into heaven? You don't. That's the answer. You don't get into heaven. That's what Jesus is driving home. You need to change your attitude. It's not just those who have fallen away and have come back. It's those who have been here and they are bitter. You need to change your heart. Because if you don't, you are also a lost sheep. But only you can choose to come back to God. Well, look at verses 31 to 32. He was a prejudice worker. He was a prejudice worker. Verses 31 to 32. And he said to him, Son, you have always been with me, and all that is mine is yours. But we had to celebrate and rejoice, for this brother of yours was dead and has begun to live, and was lost and has been found. Remember that analogy that we had at the very beginning of our lesson this morning, where there was a brother who had been a Christian, but he had fallen away for 50, 60, 70 years. And he finally came back home. And then there were other brothers and sisters saying, he doesn't deserve to come back. Look how long he's been gone. Does he really think God's going to accept him back? If Jesus was in that room, Jesus would say, yes. And if you don't, I'm not going to accept you. We need to make sure that we do not fall under this category of a Christian, where we are bitter, where we are entitled, where we are selfish, and where we are prejudiced. Because those are not attributes of a good Christian. Those are not attributes of what a Christian needs to be. That's not what Jesus was. In fact, He actively sought out those who were lost, who had gone away. While there are those who are trying to come back, and there are some who are saying, we don't want you back. Well, Jesus wants them back. Why don't you? The Father's response to His Son, you already have your reward. That is my estate. You should be happy you have your brother back. Too many Christians today, what they'll do is they'll say, I deserve the reward and you don't. And Jesus, on the day of judgment, if they do not repent of that attitude, He's going to say, you should have been happy that your brother came back. You should have been happy. You received your reward, but you yourself have squandered your reward because you're not getting into heaven now. You've squandered it not with loose living, but with a bad attitude. You can squander your reward with something else besides just blowing it all on the world. That is, with money and with this type of living. You can squander it within the church with a bad attitude. And that's what this young man was doing. I've got a question for you. Which one do you fall under in this category? And also talking about the one this morning, the lost sheep, the lost coin, and the lost son. Do you fall into one of those three categories? Or maybe just within the lost son, do you fall within those three categories? Are you somebody who has fallen away and is trying to come back home? Or are you somebody who looks at somebody who's trying to come back home and says, we don't want you? If you are either one of those, you need to repent. Or maybe you fall into a category of which Jesus is under, somebody who is actively searching, who's waiting for somebody to come back home so that you can embrace them, so that you can celebrate, so that you can give them a hug and say, I'm so glad you're back. Let's get to work together. You know, it may be the case that you fall under one of these three categories. And whichever one you fall under, maybe it's the one that you need repentance, well, you can come forward now as together we stand and as we sing.